Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? Hope you guys are doing okay. I have a cat attacking my leg. So we're going to talk about logic. Yes, the logic of cats and other stuff. Buddy, yes. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Gautama, the Aristotle of India, the guy who is closest to the syllogistic forms of Aristotle, quite interestingly close, who is following Kannada and the Vaisheshika school. The Nyaya school of Gautama focused on debate. The Vaisheshika school of Canada focused, Kannada, like the country, but with a K, like the band Korn, somewhat, is that Kannada was more of a cosmologist and was interested in debating about the cosmos. So were the Nyaya, and especially what is eternal and what is temporary in the cosmos, whether or not the gods are eternal or not with Hesiod and the ancient Greeks. And they were debating various things about fire being hot, the world being eternal or not, the self and soul being eternal or not, versus Buddhists and Jains. And Gautama and the Nyaya Aristotelian-ish logic is incredibly important for understanding Buddhist philosophy and Indian thought, especially for also comparing the Indians to the ancient Greeks. I do not believe that people understand enough Indian philosophy. I do not believe that Indian philosophy is offered enough in American universities and colleges, etc. I have met one person who teaches who taught an Indian philosophy class as an Indian philosophy class. She taught it at Fresno. So, in my years of teaching, etc. So Gautama is the Aristotle of India. Many do not know of him. I can't even explain enough how much people do not understand basic Indian philosophy in America. I am from the Haight-Ashbury, where people sort of understand a little bit, but it gets all mystical and a little interesting, a little colorful. So this is sort of the stricter Aristotelian Indian stuff, and it is quite important for showing people that it isn't just the Greeks who then led to particular ethnicities being logical. Aristotle, again, would have been amazed if you told him he invented logic, debate. He would have said, I'm pretty sure it was like that when I got here with these people, and the Egyptians and Babylonians being thousands of years older than us. Pretty sure, according to Aristotle, people debated before, and he thought he was exceptionally good at it. I teach logic also, so you can tell I'm terrible at all of this. So Gautama is the founder of the Nyaya school, and he's the author of the Nyaya Sutra, as far as we know. It could be written by his students. Like the works of Aristotle on logic, could very well be his students' notes and lecture notes on his stuff, and he didn't put pen to paper. It is the greatest text, the Nyaya Sutra. Anything sutra is a philosophy or Hindu or Indian sacred text and or philosophy text. It is the greatest manual on debate in India, like the texts collected into Aristotle's Organon. And Gautama is also known as Akshapada, eyes in the feet, or gazes at the feet, which, like Kannada's name, one who eats grain, could mean someone who gathers particulars into groups, which would be a title befitting and a nickname befitting to such a figure who's gathering particular cows into the group of all horned animals, which includes all cows and types of cows, which is the sort of Aristotelian zoology these folks were doing in order to understand logic and how to argue about the world with concrete examples. That is one very Wittgensteinian point I always like to make. Just as you can subtly hear the cat munching on food, it is always good to use particular examples. Whenever you hear somebody arguing about reason or logic or philosophy, ask yourself how many concrete examples they are using. Wittgenstein says we never use enough. The Nyaya are very interesting, and like Aristotle, they are only drawing on concrete examples to then claim there are universal groups, but they know that very empirically they are only drawing particular examples from the world. I have the video on the Sharvakas. The Sharvakas are the non-Hindu unorthodox who think nothing is just, only perception is justified. Nothing like a thought about the universal group of all horned animals and all cows is justifiable. They would say to both Aristotle and Gautama, the Sharvakas, neither of you are justified in believing all cows have horns, no matter how many cows you see or how much of Paris, France you see. As soon as you leave Paris, you are no longer justified in believing Paris exists. Even if you're texting somebody there, maybe it's all a long con and gaslighting. You know those Parisians. So, essentially, the Nyaya, unlike the Sharvaka skeptics and the Jains and Buddhists who argue against the Nyaya, they are more into subjectivity and perspective. But they are not as hardcore as the Sharvakas. The Buddhas and the Jains believe that there's proactive practices on the self. They gather up, you can do something. The Sharvakas more like, well, party a bit, enjoy the company of folks, because, hey, what are you going to do? It's much like, as mentioned, the nihilists of Russia that Nietzsche was a bit concerned with, not being a nihilist himself, somebody who's proactive about truth, which the Nyaya are, and they believe you can surround yourself with real examples of real cows, and that mostly your senses and your mind do not lie to you. The Sharvakas would say every time your mind tells you there's a group of universal cows, your mind is overgeneralizing, lying to you with the general. Concepts, what a trip. The Nyaya would say, no. Most of what your eyes, most of what your ears, and most of what your reason tells you all day long is not lies and is perfectly justifiable. And thus, they are the Nyaya, the justified, justifiable school in the words. Which is like logic. The word logic technically means something speaky, something right speech, which is like one of the eightfold of the Buddha. And the Nyaya believe, like the Buddha, there is speaking correctly, and you can speak correctly, although the Buddha would say it's more subjectively, practically, pragmatically speaking correctly, whereas the Nyaya would say, no, we are believing that this is a intentionally designed cosmos, like for Aristotle, therefore, the cosmos is not lying to us, a la Descartes and the deceiving demon, which couldn't, about his consciousness. The world is not lying to our eyes and ears and our mind very much, so we can build on empirical reality, on witnessing things with the eyes and the ears, the group of general all cows having horns. This does create a problem, just to throw a wrench in it, I always like. Is a three-legged horse no longer a horse? And there are many answers to this, but this is the sort of problem that Buddhists and others would throw at these guys. So let's get more into it. So a legend says that Thales fell into a well while gazing at the stars. The same thing supposedly happened to Gautama around the same time, around 600 BCE or so, give or take. Thales was a little earlier, Gautama a little later. Did Thales' legend get blended with Gautama in India, or are these just two different guys who are absent-minded professors falling into wells? Supposedly, according to the more deistic understanding, the legend grew that Brahma gave Gautama eyes in his feet. It should be mentioned here, by the way, Gautama is a name often ascribed to the Buddha, and some European scholars made the mistake of thinking these were the same people at some point. Some Germans I've read. Germans have been interested in Indian thought more than other Europeans for a decent long time. Unfortunately, that is somewhat bound up with the swastika borrowing and other things like that, but it's complex, and there's plenty of amazing and interestingly terrible things about all of that. But with the Indo-European language school and all the interrelations of all of that, there are I seem to have trailed off of the point, but that is, yes. There are absent-minded people, and they fall into wells while gazing at the stars. There are some German folks who have thought that Gautama and Gautama are the same person. Technically, they are from the same northern region of India, which is why Gautama is a Gautama Siddhartha is a name of the Buddha. Gautama Siddhartha, like Siddhartha of Hesse. That is the same, that is that most people's last name, surname, would be the place they are from. So Gautama does have the same name, in a sense, one of the same names as the Buddha. It is not the same guy. These are two logicians. The Buddha is very much a logician and a debater. These are the Nyaya and Gautama which I refer to as Gautama. I try to consistently say Gautama when I mean the Nyaya logician like Aristotle of India. And I say Gautama Siddhartha, but I usually just say the Buddha or Buddha when I'm referring to the other guy. Technically, Gautama are just simply, although I'm trying to be consistent, that's somewhat silly because technically Gautama are exactly, as my understanding, the same name and the same region of northern India where Jainism and Buddhism and other folks, including the Nyaya here, came from. So the name Nyaya means right, justified, or justifiable. The same way we use logical to mean justifiable and defendable in speech or debate. I do think that people highly abuse the word logic today as a logic teacher. People just say something's logical if they think it's right and it's steady, like gravity. It's logical to believe in gravity. Well, how debatable is it to believe in gravity? Along with Wittgenstein, I would suggest you don't debate gravity much and you would defer to experts. Much as Wittgenstein says, If a tribe says every night we go to the moon when we dream, you would not debate them logically. You would lead them into you would say, hey, come hang out with me for a while if you felt amicable to them. And if you didn't, you would write them off. So before you say to yourself, well, I'm a logical person, ask yourself how much you argue for anything all around you every day. I am of the opinion it is a problem that people of major systems like Christianity, like Buddhism, like Islam, and like science, people take pride in large systems. So they say this is logical, and they sort of mean I reasoned it, but they also sort of mean it's been reasoned. Well, given enough thousands and millions of people, of course it's been reasoned enough. All of the world's major religious texts say this is some sound reasoning here, and A to B to C at some point, if not throughout the whole works. It is debatable how much, logical debate here, debatable, how much the Indians or the Greeks or anybody invented logic. And Gautama and Aristotle, neither of them technically say they invented justifiable speech, nor do they defend such a position with logic. In fact, I do have to say, most students I have do not defend gravity with logic. They just look at you funny if you do not believe, if you say, well, maybe that's debatable. They'd say, what paradigm are we talking otherwise, is pretty much what happens. People don't try to defend dominant beliefs mostly. So be careful how much you say your beliefs are logical, and then you simply mean, well, it's somebody. I mean, there's an expert somewhere who knows that gravity's entirely provable. Somebody, it's not me. I mean, it's just somebody else's logic. People are susceptible to such pride and laziness so easily in all human systems. Think about how much we debate about what we're doing with any of our institutions, and you can understand how logical any logical cultures actually are compared to the Inuit, the Winnebago, or anybody else according to American pragmatists, which I proudly stand beside. So that said, which is part of the reason why I love teaching Indian logic, because wow, what do you know? The Indians and the Winnebago also, like Aristotle, were logical. He doesn't say he invented it. Other people say Aristotle invented logic long, long after Aristotle was dead, and unfortunately they're in print saying so. So the Nyaya school reached its height in 150 CE, so 150 years before Jesus was around born-ish. Sometime around, the earliest of years, and then if those are the earliest, it seems there's ones earlier here. So the school traces itself back to Gautama and his teachings. In ancient India, a king, authority, or rich patron could organize a debate and a banquet and invite participants from various schools of thought to debate. This is one of the things you'll see before there is somewhat of an understanding of difference of public and private property, etc. today. In less complicated, times, everything is somewhat shared, and then you don't have all rights to everything. And so major wealthy people, in order to, it seems that Greeks, Indians, Chinese folks, and others would invite philosophers to parties and gatherings which were sometimes more or less open to the public, and they would do this to show off, much like anybody wealthy would put their name on a building or do anything with a plaque or anything like that. They would be, this is brought to you by whatever corporation, this is a debate about this and that, let's watch these philosophers go off, because that is something to watch, and there ain't HBO yet. Is there still HBO? I don't know. But yeah, it's prime time and all of that. So in these debates, there's a story of the period that says a scholar who gave up on the Vedas, the sacred texts, and turned entirely to logic. You see a tension in Greece as well as India of debate versus religious and traditional, not only worship, but just traditional practice belief, that those sorts of tensions are in ancient Greece, India, China, and people very much say in modern times we learn to question traditional belief. People were the most famous people of human thinking, question beliefs of their day and are straining against it, otherwise they would not be famous at all. Socrates, of course, is most famous for getting killed off for questioning various things. Don't have the videos on that just yet, but we're doing the Greek videos in process here. So this guy who turned entirely to the Vedas and who turned away from the Vedas and turned entirely to logic, this scholar turned into a jackal. Not so much Anubis. This is obviously told by more Vedic Hindu priests who find this new Hinduism, which is Aristotelian logic Hindu school. They find it threatening to the worship of the gods. As mentioned with Indian philosophy, there are many routes, as with Christianity and large traditions. You can get holier, more enlightened in many ways. Philosophy and debate is one of the ways that human beings have said, probably before there was text and literacy. Debate and arguing with Steve and Susan about what the heck's going on with the mammoths is part of, not always, but part of wisdom. and how you would know who's wise and who's foolish, and who can talk the talk and debate the debate and logic the logic and word the words a bunch, so that we can have a word about words, so that we can have a word with him, if they've forgotten words and remembered them again, with Zhuangzi the Taoist. It's all very logical and counterintuitive and then intuitive again. So don't turn into a jackal by listening too much to these lectures, essentially. The other famed Nyaya logicians, they each wrote commentaries on the Nyaya Sutra of Gautama. This is how logicians and others are famous. They write commentaries on commentaries on commentaries in the Aristotelian Abrahamic world. And that there are various famous figures, including Vatsyayana, who lived around 450 CE, so 1,500 years ago, or a little more, 1,600. Udyotakara, 550 CE. Vakaspati Mishra in 900. And Udayana around the year 1000. Keep in mind, Europeans really rose above Muslims between 1600 and 1700 in money and power. And around the year 1000, Islam is having its golden age and is involved very much with India. And around the year 1000, which is 1,000 years ago, that was the last of the great commentarians on the commentaries of the Nyaya, 1,000 years ago, with Udayana. So yes. Most people, again, who are interested in Aristotle have no idea about any of this stuff, and we have yet to get to anything syllogistic, which I do find interesting in the arranging of it. So the Nyaya Sutra presents many debates that raged at the time, with many centered on dividing the mortal in particular from the eternal and universal, such as whether or not the self, world, or laws of the cosmos are permanent or fixed in this or that way. Are there permanent things, rules? Is gravity permanent in its form, structure? Is it slightly changing? How does any of that work if we only see changing things? There is in Greek and Chinese and Indian thought the preoccupation, what is eternal and what is the form of things? What is the rule of the rules? This is similar to science and all forms of investigation, scientific and not today. What is the form of what we're talking about? What is the underlying similarity or structure? And are there any absolute structures if things are all in motion? These are issues which you can watch through the Greek philosophy videos as well as these Indian philosophy videos and the Chinese philosophy videos. You can find this being central to everything. These are the Aristotelian, more objective truth debate guys who the Buddhists are pushing off against, and the Buddhism is one of the largest systems of thought in human history, along with Islam and Christianity. And Islam and Christianity have Aristotelian logic. So this is the Aristotelian logic of the third and earliest incorporated into and then skeptical of, along with Christians and Muslims with Aristotle and other Greek thinkers. This is the debate and logic of one of the largest systems of human thought, a la Buddhism, taking these sorts of debates and interrelating with them. Which is why nobody knowing about this stuff is actually pretty incredible to think about, because it's 2020, and again, I struggle to find anything in English about this stuff, but this is me putting together in English what I can, as I do with these sorts of things, and I hope there's much better work following me, and I trust that it will be. I don't actually believe that people will all know about Indian, Chinese, or Greek logic altogether in my lifetime, because I've been doing this for 14 years, and I gotta say, every year, students are like, wow, Babylon can think, that's amazing. It's like, yeah, nobody's really trying to figure out, not in the sciences or humanities, how much anybody other than the Greeks can think, which is why I still do this, honestly, because it's full of amazing, and it can teach you a lot about your own thinking every single day, even though these are Indians, like some of my friends. So we have here that one of these questions, Kanada asks this earlier in the Vaisheshika Sutra, which is probably 100 years earlier-ish than the Nyaya. And the Nyaya and Gautama are borrowing from them and debating them, but on their side much. They debate whether or not sound is temporary. What is the sound of one hand clapping, and is the self permanent with Buddhism? And Kanada, like a Buddhist, says that it is temporary. Sound is mortal. Unlike the soul and self, according to the Hindus. For the Hindus, you do have a permanent self, an Atman. For the Buddhists and Jains, you do not have a permanent self, an Atman, non-permanent self. Although it's permanent enough self, oddly, to get reincarnated in various ways and then get up to a Pure Land or a Hell World for a little while as a ghost being, which is strange, and there's a bunch of anime that involves a lot of that kind of stuff, as well as Buddhist mudra hand signals and such. But yes, technically you don't have a permanent self, although you have a weirdly self that's enduring beyond one life for a lot of Buddhist thought, although the earliest of Buddha, which we'll get to soon, Buddha did not actually say, and specifically says he does not say whether or not there is or is not an afterlife, which leaves the door open for Buddhist schools to say, okay, you don't have a permanent self, but permanence somewhat, sort of, for thousands of years, if not, which oddly sounds, like Empedocles before jumping into the volcano and becoming a golden god. So debates about what part of the temporary world, and if sound is impermanent, is your self like sound, and what signs of the self and sound can we empirically deduce to know that self is or isn't like sound? Is the world permanent? Are there fixed rules, like is gravity a fixed form of things, invisible? And then do we have visible falling things that temporarily fall, but gravity itself remains the same? Do numbers and human math remain the same, unlike for crystalline beings who need not have human arithmetic? Is that fully formed forever? But if you only see apricots and you count them out, and if they can get crushed if Steve sits on one, then how is math permanent but apricots aren't? These are questions I do love asking people still. That is the meat and how to present it to people of these Hindu, decently vegetarian folk. We'll get to super vegetarian veganism with the Jains in a little bit. So a lot of these seem to take the form of a bifurcating disjunction. Is A B or not B? To be or not to be, Horatio. That is a good form. I like to call this the form of Nyaya debate. It's not a Nyaya form. It is, however, that most of the questions they ask is X Y or not Y? And this is, of course, a very human form of doubt and argumentation you would find the whole world over. I call it the Nyaya form because many of their questions they specifically ask, is the world eternal or not? Is the self permanent or not? Not only is B a lot of times here, or Y, whichever variables you're using, is permanent or impermanent, eternal or not eternal, like the gods may or may not be, according to Heraclitus in Greece, that is X, Y, or not Y, that this is the most basic form of asking any question. So I call it the Nyaya form, but I'm not claiming it was invented in India, just like I'm saying Aristotle did not invent logic or debate and did not claim to. And people who say he did, and there's a lot in print saying Aristotle invented debate. Just stare that over after this lecture, and again, you'll see a little bit of cracks in all of that, I swear. So, Vedic priests argued that the individual self is eternal. The Charvakas and Buddhists and Jains argued it is temporary. The Jains technically, I have been teaching that the Jains do not believe in a permanent self. Technically, they sort of do, but everything does get swept up into the sort of the oneness of things. But the Jains do, interestingly, have somewhat that you are somewhat retain your individuality in that. Although I am unclear about that, and I have been taught before that the Jains are very anekantavada, don't have a permanent self school. It is more complicated, though, looking through the sources. So it is very much that the Hindus and the Orthodox believe you have a permanent self. The Jains and Buddhists and the skeptics and the Charvakas don't. But the Jains kind of do, and the Buddhists somewhat. Abandon that, but then have pure lands and hell worlds. So, and reincarnation still, like the Jains and Hindus. They all have reincarnation, like a lot of Greek philosophers. And probably the Egyptians, and only the pharaoh got to have an eternal afterlife up into the stars. And just like the Tao was for the emperor in China, and then it's for everybody, the pharaoh gets an eternal afterlife, and then after a while, everybody in the Abrahamic world wants one. Reincarnation isn't good enough for folks. I don't know. You're given a world, you're given a life, but that's not good enough, you know? Heck. Well, maybe there's another one, you know? It could be like this one, though. That'll be terrible. So, the Buddhists who debated the Nyaya often use relative qualifiers, such as A is sometimes B, or A is somewhere B, or A is B in some things in some ways. I am a constant Wittgensteinian and a pragmatist, decently, so I try to be decent in what I do, you know? So, what that would mean is actually, if you said all X is Y, the first thing somebody more skeptical would say to you in thought is, well, where and when? As Wittgenstein says, if I did tell you math is good, your next question should really be, but for what, when, and how? You know, if I said, well, you know, Buddhism has done good in the world, you know, simply, yes. Your next question should probably be, but how much and to what extent and where, you know? Is that we qualifying things, just saying, well, X is Y, we're done. Relative qualifiers are a bit of, space and time and subjectivity and perspective along there with the general and the objective, and all that mixed together is the duck rabbit we're constantly facing, a la Wittgenstein. This stuff is marvelously complementary to Wittgenstein also. If you find me too skeptical, I do find it is very useful, and I've incorporated it into a lot of my arguments, that the Nyaya, they do believe that because your eyes and ears don't lie to you, that does set us up nicely for Wittgenstein saying, yes, but I can distrust my eyes and ears because I can start having hallucinations and say, hey buddy, you seeing these whales outside in the apocalypse movie or not? I don't know. Because I could trust what you tell me even as I distrust my eyes and ears. I could trust you, but how do I hear what you say or watch your lips move if I can't trust my eyes and ears? Well, oddly, we're in a strange arrangement of trust, and the Nyaya are somewhat correct in saying, as many a philosopher would say, as I believe Hume would also intone, who may or may not have known of Tibetan Buddhism, according to Gopnik, is that your eyes and ears do not lie to you most of the time, as far as we can tell. Which is the skeptical problem anybody would bring up with subjectivity. So that means most of the time I treat my eyes and ears as if they are not lying to me, which is the situation. And the Nyaya do acknowledge this. They're very Wittgensteinian and pragmatic in saying, but there can be problems with your eyes, problems with your ears, and they list these off in counterexamples, which is, as Wittgenstein says, giving many concrete examples, positive and negative, which when people overgeneralize, which the Nyaya would be accused of doing by the Jains and the Buddhists, if people overgeneralize, they may not be asking so many hows and wheres and whens. Again, when you hear something good, something bad, how, where, when would be more the Buddhist response. And this is a lecture for not only Indian philosophy, but especially for Buddhist philosophy. You should understand these ideas before you take on Zen. A lot of people come to Zen Buddhism and they think, oh, it's just mystical and just like, oh, it just blows your mind and doesn't leave anything there. You should understand that Zen and Buddhist monks and other people would be very familiar with these debates and be very familiar, perhaps not reading the Nyaya Sutra, but reading the Buddhist texts which are written in response about the very same debates about whether or not the world is permanent, the self is permanent, and whether or not there are any rules, scientific, religious, or otherwise, to the cosmos, like math or otherwise. If you don't understand that, you will not get how brilliant Zen Buddhism is and how simple and understandable for many an illiterate person, even though you would go to a Buddhist monastery to learn how to be a literate person, like a monk in Christian medieval lands. That's where literacy was. And yet, all of them, again, were very familiar whether or not they read these texts with these sorts of debates and can use hand signals and other things to use concrete examples right in front of your eyes of things being one and many, of sound being impermanent, all of that. So Gautama and the Nyaya are very powerful and very awesome. Whether or not they are completely Aristotelian or whether or not they are as skeptical as later Wittgenstein, they complement later Wittgenstein's skepticism and uncertainty, something fierce. I do like Wittgenstein's uncertainty, and I do like the Nyaya very much. So one of the powerful ideas here is that there are 4 sources of knowledge. This is a very powerful and awesome idea. I've been highly influenced by this. In fact, I am speculating about what primary feelings we mix together and primary sources of things like eyes and ears. And I have to admit, I am extremely influenced by this stuff and trying to parse out Wittgenstein and what he is saying in his thought experiments by paying attention to, so this is an interaction of the eyes versus the ears versus the emotion here, in a sense. Although that isn't exactly what they are doing, but they have 4 sources of knowledge which are quite powerful. And that they argue with their system that the world is a coherent positive whole. It makes sense coherently, which is not what Wittgenstein would necessarily say. On one, there is the primary source of knowledge is perception for the Nyaya, which makes them very much empiricists, which makes them very similar to modern science. In the ancient world, people had to observe lightning and clouds, and they did not have as much equipment to experiment. Of course, they used all their tools and equipment to experiment with reality. How couldn't they, as they do things and make mistakes? But modern times, which includes Chinese technology and Islamic cultures and algebra and Chinese technology, and then the Europeans and the Italian Renaissance, people increasingly set up technology to experiment. So increasingly, the power of modern science, which is not simply for the public good or used that way, or we're not simply aware of how much we're making helicopters in America, so it's not a power of self-awareness with science or knowing you're doing good in the world just because you're doing truth or something repeatable. It doesn't tell you all the angles and what it's used for, but that's some of the view of the thing and how it's used. that perception is primary, and so everything around you doesn't lie to your eyes and ears most of the time, which is the only reason you're not stuck in a Wittgensteinian solipsistic world where you're constantly looking outside, seeing strange reality you've never seen before, and asking your friend, how do we cope with this today? It is only, postmodernists like Deleuze say truth is repetition. This is very similar, although the French postmodernists are far more skeptical than the Nyaya about objective truth. The repetition of perception, not belief or words. This is a very important Wittgensteinian point also. It is not your mind talking to you or your mind reasoning regularly, which is the regularity of the world. It is the regularity of your eyes and ears perceiving the bus in the same way and the street. And then you also reason, well, that bus blur, and you start using words to yourself, as Vygotsky says we learn as children, to talk to ourselves and talk to others both at the same time. But you need not talk to yourself about the world for the world to be perceived regularly. That's a very important point, especially for modern European philosophy, because a lot of times people treat perception as if it is a belief. But that's mixing up words, kind of like Nietzsche accuses Descartes of confusing consciousness with thought, because thought has content. Consciousness is just awareness, need not have content per se, rational content. If I look at the camera I'm staring at, I don't have to talk to myself about it, I am to you, but I can see it and glance at it and know what it is without talking about it. So how much is that conceptual? That is a very important and interesting point. I will leave off those debates for later. The only point that I'm making right now, this is all going to be great stuff to talk about with Wittgenstein, and I'll be doing some of him at the end of the Buddhist philosophy class, because I'm going to be doing a good lecture on, well, hopefully it's good, I don't know yet. It could be good and bad in points, probably, if it's human, on Wittgenstein and Buddhism. This right here, the regularity, the perception, the first source of knowledge, the primary source of knowledge, the regularity of perception, I would say, along with Wittgenstein's certainty, is the regularity of the objective world. The problem is that it's highly confusable with wording and argument and logic. You have to take extra steps to argue grass is always green. You can see grass is green and feel and know, and Heidegger calls it comportment. You can be towards the grass as green grass, let's just call it without using more words. But that doesn't mean you have beliefs about all grass being green. You're seeing green grass, that doesn't mean there ain't Kentucky bluegrass somewhere else, you know? Just because there's green grass here doesn't mean burnt grass isn't blackened and gone plenty much. So, in a certain sense, all grass is not green, and you didn't think that by seeing green grass once or twice as a kid. And even as a scientist looking at green grass, you are not necessarily noticing greenness in this grass, thinking all grass is universally green, nor need it be. We're in a world with mostly orange grass. So, no. That's where people often take the leap here, and the Nyaya are very careful and awesome in ancient India. People often take the mistaken leap and think, I know that it's rational for me to look at grass as green and then know things with words. That's another step here, which we'll get to. So the primary, this is such a good thought, the fourfold system of the Nyaya, it's worth pausing on for a while. Perception is the regularity of the world. That very much works with Wittgenstein's uncertainty. We see things regularly happen and hear things regularly happen. Think about how your mind blends your eyes and your ears together, such that I see and hear things, and it's all, if I hear somebody bite into an apple, that's an apple. I see an apple, that's an apple. My head seamlessly, without issue, weaves all that together. And I haven't even thought a word about apples yet. I am perceiving apples. It is arguable I have yet to have a belief about any of these apples in an operative, pragmatic sense. But yet I am aware of them, so how much is that conceptual? Some would say if there's an apple there, it's conceptual. The Nyaya and Wittgenstein would probably push back against that and say, but the concepts actually come along with and interwoven with that. I am reading a bit into the Sharvakas here, but I am going to read them in a somewhat Wittgensteinian way, and we don't have enough of all of that to know entirely. But I am going to argue the way I am seeing them talk, and I'm arguing in their favor, because even though I am not ultimately a Nyaya, and I'm ultimately more skeptical with them and with the Buddhists and Wittgenstein, these are very powerful, and the Buddhists are incorporating these into one of the largest systems of thought that has ever existed, and one that everyone knows its name. Pretty much. You got to be living under a rock to have never heard of Buddhism, I'd imagine, and I'm Californian, so heck. So we got here, the first source of knowledge worth pausing on is perception. Now that's your eyes, your ears, they list those out, as does Aristotle, as does Plato. In fact, Plato and Aristotle say, and this is very Kundalini yoga, your higher senses, which can see farther, are up on top. Plato and Aristotle, Plato argues in the Timaeus, this is divine, according to a Pythagorean named Timaeus. Part of the divine plan is that the lower your senses are, your skin, your tongue, your smell, the more you have to touch things immediately, you have to taste things immediately, you can smell things, thankfully, only a short distance. You can see things, you can hear things a farther distance than you can smell, and you can see farther than you can hear. And Plato and Aristotle probably considered that divine, part of the, well, they almost certainly would have considered that part of the divine plan, and that fits Kundalini yoga with the higher centers of self going upward. So we don't have that explicitly in the text here as we do in the Timaeus, but they definitely list out the senses, and it would seem, along with a lot of them, they are assuming you understand that there's very simple A to B to C to D kinds of orders and things, and they may be laying that out, but they often leave that between the lines. So you have perception. Then you have the next of the four is inference, which is... Inference is something the Vaisheshika and Kannada already talked about. Inference is when you draw a connection. That cow has horns. That cow has horns. That cow has horns. I see many cows who have horns. Let's pretend I didn't say that to myself in words. And then I start talking words to myself, and I say, now I'm going to be all conceptual and argumentative and logical. Meaning I'm using words now. I wasn't using words when I was staring at the cows all having horns each at a time before. So now I start using words to myself because I'm no longer a child and can use adult words. And I say, well, cows and horns and stuff, all cows have horns because cows are in the group of horned animals as far as I can tell. And that would be inference, which the inference is, of course, each step of the syllogistic reasoning or what have you. They also have the third, comparison. Some translate as analogy, but analogy would be a comparison like life is like a sailing ship, and that it is exactly like it travels, it does this, it does that. It also doesn't have a sail, so a metaphor is and isn't like one thing, which is what a metaphor is, not just a like, but something truly, not just metaphorically, like something else, and something not like something else, which Hindu grammarians and philosophers discuss at the same time. So, and testimony. Is the final of the four. Witness. Now think about religious texts, think about witness in the Gospels, etc. And think about, I've already done some of the videos on the long discourses. Whenever you have any of the discourses of the Buddha, it always starts with the words, and it's not the Buddha, thus I have heard, which would be hearing, the testimony of the testimony of the testimony, and that is all impermanent and sound and not fully known, according to the Buddhists. So you have to attest to things as what your ears have shown you, heard to you, yes. But at the same time, you're just asserting what is human and impermanent. Now notice testimony is very much, we would still say testimony and then logic and reason and everything in comparison is what you get in a court of law. All of this stuff, of course, is what kings would have in courts, because a king in a court anywhere in the ancient or modern world, or jurists in the Islamic world, Avicenna was a jurist, he'd be on a panel of three guys, somebody would come in and say, somebody burned down my alfalfa barn, with the al and the falfa in the Islamic world, the animal feed, and you'd say, okay, well, it seems like this guy wasn't there at the time, what do you guys think? And you would try to figure out, okay, with testimony, hey, call her in, okay, what does she say? And yes, women were not permitted to testify in all different courts of the world. In Islamic courts, they were off in the Golden Age, but that is, again, something probably variously practiced as it is variously practiced today, etc., and all those things. So what we have here, there are four sources, pramana, of knowledge for the Nyaya, but the latter three are secondary and inferior to the first, which is perception, direct experience, concrete examples, good and bad, supporting and counter and contrary, of what we infer, compare, or hear about through testimony of others. The word pramana, which the Nyaya use for source, foundation, or evidence, means proof, and comes from the word roots for out from, pra, and measurement, ma, such that measuring out things, the measuring out or figuring out, to judge things, to talk them out in debate. As usual, a lot of our fanciest words are French, Latin, which are just sort of cave people speak kind of syllables, which then could apply to three or four things, and we apply it in word use to one particular thing. The measuringness of then becomes a very specific term for a very specific kind of practice. The Buddhists refer to it as Pramanavada, possibly. Again, I try to pronounce these more the way of not second to last syllable like the English. And just to fake, again, the pronunciation. Pronunciation's a little bit pronunciations. Winning. The way of viewpoint or measuring things out. The Nyaya argue a proper understanding of the inventory of reality, the inventory or store of reality. There are many others. Actually, store is a very much a word which in early English basically means whatever you've amassed and organized. Your store is what you've stored up. And a store is just somewhere where there's lots of supplies and they're somewhat organized. And of course, we understand a store somewhere which is like that, and you go and pay money to it, whether or not it's a trading post or an actual store or just a store of treasure or something like that. So this is actually, in the Indian stuff, they do mean that we have an inventory, a store, an organization. The world itself is an organization, an intentional design. Something like a store in which there's Doritos or not, of different kinds. So yeah, you have here weirdly that there's different sorts. It's like reality's already organized. You know what I mean? And yeah, so assuming reality as an order independent of our minds and cultural practices. Again, that is a very major, if you believe in objectivity, a lot of times you would say reality is organized and there's an order to it. Like a child orders blocks. If you are more subjective, you would often say, well, whether or not there's intention behind the cosmos, we don't see absolute regularities and things are still subjective. Vatsyayana, the foremost Nyaya logician, after Gautama, says that all of the Nyaya method is investigation of subjects by means of sources, foundations, proof, evidence. And Udyotakara says the best reasoning involves many sources to establish a position well. John Locke, the empiricist from England, from early modern European philosophy, didn't mean a smoke monster, pretty sure. He says similarly, he believes in objective truth, but he also says, but truth is always cobbled together from many different subjective sources of evidence. Which does leave open the question the Buddhists would ask here, John Locke and the Nyaya. So if you cobble together objectivity out of a stable variety pragmatically of subjective sources, guess what happens to your objectivity after that, kids? Spoiler alert, let's leave that for the end. Yes, when we finally figure everything out. So the Nyaya lean towards innocent until legitimate doubt about belief, which means they tend to lean towards positive belief. Again, they really are like Descartes. God wouldn't lie to me. Maybe Satan rules over 2 + 3 = 5 in math, but God wouldn't lie to me about me being conscious. Therefore, math and science and the church are trustable. Sources in my life, religion and science equally, about telling me rules, and they must be permanent because I'm conscious, therefore I think, therefore I am. The Nyaya similarly are somewhat, no, the world isn't lying to me. There's gods, there's the world, it's deception, it's Maya, sure, but it's not lying to me overall. Notice Buddhists and others would be more like, well, it's sort of the veil of illusion, ain't it? Constantly with desire and everything. Desire plays a much more deceptive role in Buddhism overall, whereas the Nyaya are leaning towards the factual evidence. Facts, unless it's even non-verbalized, these problems. That your eyes and your ears aren't lying to you, so your mind and your reasoning and my words to you and your words to yourself and your mind about my words, they're mostly not lies, most likely. It seems the way they lean. Now, they don't really prove it as much as lean into it, I'd say, but that would go with the philosophy, wouldn't it? How would you prove it as a rationalist rather than an empiricist, downward deductively rather than upward inductively and empirically, right? There's a balancing of objective and subjective here, as there often is in philosophy. Some things are objective-ish, others are subjective-ish, and it is very much intertangled, which is the wrestling of philosophy with the world a lot. Some people think it goes round and round without doing anything. If you learn anything, well, it helps you out. So inferences can be hastily drawn. That is one of the messages of all of this. It teaches you patience and perspective and the parts. But if they are drawn slowly, based in good, careful reason, we should entertain them positively and favorably, not as certain, but as openly possible. The same is true of perception, comparison, and testimony, such that they are overall reliable if we are careful with them. If a belief that exists is doubtable, we should investigate it with sources and testing possibilities, using hypothetical reasoning, tarka. The Charvakas Buddhists and other skeptics doubt that conviction and coherence is what we need, as opposed to tranquility and perspective. Tranquility and calm is a major goal of philosophers around the world. The goal is not necessarily happy, roller coaster-like excited happiness. The goal is resolution into something like patience and calm, like the caterpillar teaches Alice in the center of Wonderland. So, in the beginning of Vatsyayana's commentary on the Nyaya Sutra, he argues, and I am quoting, when things are grasped through sources of knowledge, pramana, it is possible to act and succeed. A little bit of pragmatism. Thus, sources of knowledge are useful, arthavat. Without sources of knowledge, there would be no successful action. Success is a relationship with its result, gaining or losing things, which could be happiness or sadness, or some way to or from either. The ends served by sources of knowledge are innumerable, since the living things who use sources of knowledge are themselves innumerable. When sources of knowledge are connected to things, so are the knower, known, and knowledge. Why? Because without all of these, knowledge of things is impossible. Now think about, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Well, it's not. Sound is impermanent. Without the knower, the known, knowledge is impossible. The sound of one hand clapping is very much with the Buddhists and the Zen folks. I don't know how much they clapped in front of the Nyaya, the early Buddhists, but when Zen people do what is the sound of one hand clapping, I do believe, and given the language and that we'll get to Zen, they are thinking of this sort of thing specifically, even if they are not reading the Nyaya text. That you have the knower, you have your subjective, you have the objective world, and the meaning and the semantics and the reality and the experience is like sound impermanent in the interaction of world, which for Buddhists would be impermanent, for self, which would be impermanent. Now for the Nyaya, self and world are both permanent. So you would have in the interaction of them, then you would have objective knowledge. But if self and world are not permanent, then you would have, like sound, for these same Nyaya and Vaisheshika schools, sound, like meaning and reality and self, would be impermanent, like your self-concept of yourself is impermanent, but it's given a kind of permanence in the mind for the Buddhists. So they are debating actually with this very similar form of objective, subjective, together is knowledge. This is very pragmatism, and pragmatists in America lean more towards there is objective scientific knowledge, and they also lean towards but it's human cultural practices like the Winnebago hunting and gathering. What is that book? There is a good book from the 1930s about how the Winnebago are as rational as anybody else by the pragmatist Radin, or Radin, I am not sure, but he was teaching in America in the 1930s and 40s, and I believe he is associated with Dewey, and he writes a lot about how the Winnebago are as logical and rational as you and I. I don't think so. Only the Nyaya and the Indians are rational. None of the rest of us are. That's what I'm going to argue. I'm not going to use evidence or examples either. I'm going to overgeneralize, like the human mind often does, which is what these checks and balances are for, obviously, in the inner relation of things. Primarily are the people and perspective, of course, and the eyes and the ears. Then there's the higher mind. So with all of this, when you have the knower, known, and knowledge, without all of these, knowledge is impossible. Without this triangle, the top point of knowledge here is impossible. Without the knower and the known, the subjective, the objective, you have the known and knowledge. It fits perfectly with American pragmatism in many ways. We're going to do lectures on American pragmatism next semester here, because I got modern European and stuff. So, the person who acts with desire, a little bit of ethics and personal conduct here, of fear, whoever acts with fear is the knower. The way is known is the source of knowledge. The known is the object, and truthful thought made the right way is knowledge. So in other words, the subjective has desire or fear, positive or negative. There are many folks of the ancient world and modern world who have said you can see people like things and they dislike things, so they move towards things and they move away from things. And people definitely know that meaning has to do with going towards and gathering things or moving away from and fearing things. That's very much modern psychology, of course. And you find it here very explicitly laid out in these texts. Many times people think the Greeks alone were scientific in the ancient world. Again, there's just, if you read Indian and Chinese texts, which I will present to you in these sorts of lectures, you can easily see that folks have just been phoning it in and reading some Greek text and not bothering to read the Nyaya Sutra at all. By the way, try to find this thing printed in English for fun on Amazon. Try to find it. You will find it somewhat, but it is sort of here, sort of there. And again, I hope there's more printing going on. You can look on Amazon or any website and see how much this has been printed in English, why, and how long. And yeah, many people believe Aristotle invented human reasoning, and white Western people have it. Isn't that great? They've believed that for a while, especially Protestants, even though it was the Catholic Church that handed them a lot of Aristotle, even though it was the Muslims who handed a lot of these Christians a lot of Aristotle with Al-Farabi and Avicenna and stuff. Apparently Aristotle and the Muslims, no, the Christians invented logic. You know what I mean? Well, now it's secular science. Somebody invented logic. I'm pretty sure it's like the human mind, 200,000 years old or something. But you know what? Let's not talk about that right now. Instead of that, let's use concrete examples and not overgeneralize, as already mentioned. So, the truth is fully grasped when all four are in place. Notice it did not say losing bias or fear or desire. That is an integral part of subjectivity, which is the connections of the whole. I still find a lot of people talk about principle itself and not subjectivity as part of objectivity, and they act like objective principle can float on its own without fear or desire or bias, which again, these guys are not claiming and cannot be physically witnessed, words being used without fear or desire or human want or need or emotion. There are experiments, for instance, I have read where people put people on massive doses of antidepressants, unfortunately in tragic cases, but also in cases where they're experimenting on massive doses of antidepressants, hopefully ethically. And when asked, what are you thinking about? A lot of times people are like, nothing. You know what I mean? They're just sort of in a weird state and kind of their minds wandering around aimlessly, very much disassociatively. And without concrete fear or desire, it's like, what would you think about and why? So there's a little bit of subjectivity mixed up in your objectivity. The text goes on. This is the commentary on the Nyaya again. So, what is truth? It is the grasping of being in something that is and not being in something that isn't. Being and not being, positive and negative. Grasping what is as what is, and what isn't as what isn't, is truth, as it is, unchanging. I believe Confucius said to take the known for the known, and the unknown for the unknown, not Donald Rumsfeld, is what knowledge is, and how to conduct oneself. So how can something, the text continues here in quote, how can something that isn't B grasped through a knowledge, how can something that isn't B be grasped through a knowledge source? How do we know something isn't? At the time there is, and that is grasped, perceived. We use the word grasp to mean conceptualize as well as perceive across human languages because we have hands and we grasp things. Lakoff and Johnson mentioned this. There is not grasping something that isn't, like the light of a lamp that shows something that is and also what isn't. We think if it was there, it would have been seen, but it wasn't seen, so it isn't. Now what this means, of course, is in the unity of your perceptions, if you see a lamp and you don't see light, then you know the lamp isn't lit. And it's, of course, how do you know the lamp isn't lit? By what you don't see. Because we've seen it be lit, and so we don't see in the absence, we grasp what we do not grasp, in that it is dark rather than light. In Through the Looking Glass, Alice tells the White King she sees no one on the road. And the king says, wow, having such eyes, seeing no one at such distance. I wish I could do that. There's a great joke in The Simpsons where Lisa is listening to an avant-garde violinist and she's enjoying it. And the guy at the next table in the cafe is like, oh, this is terrible. She's like, you have to listen to the notes she's not playing. And the guy's like, I can do that at home. You know, a lot of times with the mind, it is what you see and what you don't see. And there are Buddhist interesting things. There's a great Zen Zen monk asks a Zen master in China, probably about 1,000 years after the Nyaya Sutra. It says, what is enlightenment like? Or what is the meaning of Buddhism? Which are all interchangeable, interesting questions for the Zen. And the guy says, it is like trying to grasp a pillow behind your head at night. You know, when you like wake up and you're like, where's the pillow? Well, think about it, like if you see a lamp and you don't see the light, you're like, nope, there isn't any light there. Don't grasp light. Therefore, grasp is dark, is not light, as opposed to here. So that, again, actually, it's like, what is the meaning, the central meaning of Buddhism? What's the rule of the rules that makes reality all make sense? Oh, it's like trying to grab at something and not be, I just can't grab at what the meaning of life, I keep trying to grab at what the meaning of life is as opposed to an open, empty freeness. And I keep reaching behind my head and I can't grasp it. Well, the Nyaya, like the Stoics, are like, this is knowledge. This is certainty. We are grasping the certain with objectivity as opposed to, it is empty. It is open. It is subjective. Because it is empty and not grasped, therefore impermanent. And that. These are all examples, concrete examples you could use: grasping your fist, clapping, things like that, holding up two fingers, which are very Zen responses to various things. You can't see no one, but you can look. Double negatives for Black Americans were proper English in Scottish, Irish, Scottish, and British early English. Ain't no, and other things like that. Double negatives actually do work fine, and people grasp that plenty. Is not illogical, because it used to be proper English plenty. Ain't no what. So we can't see no one not, and you still know what I meant, but we can look and not see anyone, which can be said and understood as seeing no one. And these play on words find their ways into, watch the lecture on Hui Shi of Chinese logic as well, and the School of Names. Greek, Indian, and Chinese philosophers know how to play with language in ways that are strikingly human and trans language beyond any particular transcultural, generally human, because they have to do with forms of language, it would seem. Perhaps forms of life, and there may or may not be permanent fixed forms of language. But you can debate with Chomsky and Everett about all of that, whether or not you can sleep if there are snakes. I highly recommend the book, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. And I won't even get into that right now, but you can ask if there are permanent anythings, and if math exists, or just more and less with the Piraha. Because they don't have words for 2, 3, and 5. And that's probably what we all didn't have. Because you look for it and you just can't grasp it there. But after you've seen the light of the lamp, then you know the light wasn't there before. So if people don't use number words, do they have math at all? And are there forms of thought or just human practices outside and inside the mind altogether, as whatever we practice? That would be the more Wittgensteinian example. And it fits with the Nyaya something fierce. If perception and reality is primary, it would be primarily pragmatic and practiced and perceived. Hakuin painted the Zen famous Buddhist, painted blind men walking carefully on a log bridge, and you can sort of feel the log bridge is slippery, and you can feel the blind men are in danger. How do you look at blind men and see that they're all in danger and feel that way is a very Zen thing. That's all interrelated with this. I won't get into that either right now, just like the snakes. You go first. So let's see. You likely, again, don't talk out a lot of this, and yet your mind is the tangle of all. A lot of philosophers, I find, don't talk this out enough. So Udyotakara, the later Nyaya logician and commentarian, says if commentarian is a word I just made up, says in his commentary that all sources depend on perception. And sources of knowledge give us a true grasp of things. But there are fake sources of knowledge, and acting on a true source of knowledge leads to success, and acting on a fake source leads to failure. How does failure look, if not like a lack of success? And another sort of seeing what you don't see or imagine but did not perceive. The Nyaya Sutra and commentaries tell us that there are problems we have with the four sources of knowledge such that we can misperceive and see what isn't there, or not see what is there, such as recognize unrecognized success or talent, as they talk about, even though perception is their primary source that supports all others insofar as the others are justified. Perception is seeing or experiencing something for oneself. It can only be valid if it tells you something that doesn't vary or change, like a mirage, as all these guys know about. 3 examples of false perception. That is a real perception of a cat clawing things. Yes? What's up, buddy? I perceive this cat regularly enough. So, and yes, the examples of false perception given in the sutra, and notice if your perception varies, if I suddenly see whales in the sky, maybe my eyes and mind are lying to me, are confusing smoke with dust. This is a problem Greek logicians also have. Appears in the work of Aristotle, I do believe. Smoke and dust, think about how if you see a bunch of what looks like smoke, you would run there and gallop on your best horse and be like, oh no, there's a fire at the old barn, Cindy Lou. And it turns out, no, it's just a bunch of horses or cattle being herded kicking up dust. That would have been a very big problem in India and Greece of the ancient world with cattle and horses and all of that. So confusing smoke and dust is your eyes lying to you in the ancient world, very much like a mirage. Like a cat who is searching for activities. What's up, buddy? Come say hello. Yes. You perceive a cat. Yes. This cat, it tastes like a cat. It must be a cat. Yes. Wait a minute. It's coming to me. Yep, it's a cat. Okay. So now that we've thought that through and talked all that out, we are logical, rational Western people now. So there's another popular example. There's a famous Indian novel, which is a modern novel called The Rope and the Snake. This is an example of the Nyaya. And then you find Buddhist Zen folks and others saying, well, a rope and a snake, huh? That a rope would be a fake snake. And notice a rope is an artificial construction of human beings that can be easily confused for a snake. And notice how primordial the fear of snakes is, and how it symbolizes something like fear or desire, like the snake in the Garden of Eden, etc. The rope and the snake. There is a famous Indian novel about a man who is in an arranged marriage, and he finds it loveless, and the woman is terrible to him. And then he falls in love with a prostitute. Now notice a prostitute is, of course, this is flagged for, by the way, a prostitute is somebody who hands out ice cream, because this video is for children, marked on YouTube. And essentially, he falls in love with this woman, and she is, so which is the rope and which is the snake? Which is real love? And I have not read the novel. I actually have a copy of it. I found and picked up. I believe it was written in the 90s. I would have to double check that. But you can notice the play, and notice the old Aristotelian-ish Gautama Nyaya example, and that this actually reverberates throughout Hindu talk, expressions, Indian thought, just like you find Chinese philosophy being common Chinese expressions, pure gold does not fear heat, of the Taoists, etc. That there are many fine ways where rope and the snake finds its way into Indian culture. It's a marvelous, simple metaphor. And everybody knows what ropes and snakes are, except for the Hawaiians, or maybe the Irish, but I don't know. There's a great, actually, speaking of which, many of the Carol De Morgan and others have Irish ancestry that they somewhat play down in being British folks. And there's De Morgan once quotes a logic joke. Seems like he is aware of Indian logic, doesn't speak much about it at that time. And he says there's an old Irish joke where somebody's pulling up a rope and they're pulling it and they're pulling it and they're pulling it up and they're like, someone has cut off the other end of this here rope. They cut off the end because it's not perceived. The non-being of the end of the rope isn't perceived because it keeps being rope. Someone has cut off the non-being and the end on the end of this rope here. It's continuous and infinite. Yeah, it's good old-fashioned Irish wit, and all that. A little rap in the rap, Well, the British mistreat people is what I mean. So the Vats, not their own though, I'm sure that's great. They have healthcare. So Vatsyayana says that some argue that for everything there is a word and name that is based on conventional practices, vyavahara. And so perceptual thinking is verbal in nature. But this is a mistaken view, seeing words where they aren't there, as we can look at an object without knowing its name. So perceptual understanding is not dependent on language. That is extremely similar to Wittgenstein. That is what I was pointing out earlier, which is why I was reading it in this way, is that we know Vatsyayana, regardless of whether or not this is exactly the view of the earlier Nyaya, and I don't find enough in that early work that contradicts this, so it's hard to know whether or not this is a latter interpretation, but it stands uncontradicted by much, even though human thought wanders around and does contradict itself and is not perfect and perfectly systematic, I would argue. He is actually saying here, if you walk around perceiving cars moving down the street and you're thinking about your great aunt Susan, technically you are not conceiving the cars on the street, but you are perceiving them. This opens up which is very important. What this would mean is, if we were talking modern psychology, and I am fine to listen to all different sorts of psychologists talk about this, there are different ways of conceiving of things, let us say. Conception, it's quite it's a hard practice of labor, that you basically, as a midwifery of Socrates would attest, that if I see a car on the street, in a certain sense I'm conceptualizing it, but in another way I am conceptualizing the car when I verbalize about it at all. If I see a car and I hate it, I'm like, that's almost sort of a concept, but it is at least a concept when I say I don't like that car at all. Vygotsky says we actually substitute images, or we don't need to if I'm looking right at the car. I could think words like, it's terrible, or terrible, along with looking at the car. Now that's a conception because it involves words on a level, let's say, which is more so than when I see the cars moving up and down the street, recognize them as cars, treat them as cars, but I am verbalizing to myself pretty much entirely about my great aunt Susan, what a jerk. That would be that verbalization is conceptualization in a way that, yes, looking at a table as a table and not a snack involves the mind, and not a culture that eats tables as snacks, a la table monster cookie monsters. But who would walk into the room and see the table as a snack and start eating it, which is not how we would act. But there's a way where that's conceptual, but it's not conceptual like verbalization. And why is that important? Because we are talking about some of the world's most famous logicians. And logicians deal with not so much emotions. They try to repress those. Well, some of them do. We all do. Not so good at talking today. But other than repressing all of that, they use words. They talk to you in concepts, and they say all cows have horns. And there's an awareness, if I didn't have words, if a dog doesn't have many words, a dog would not know how to be like, all cows have horns, Steve. All treats taste good, except for the bad ones, so I do not call them treats in words. Maybe dogs are more verbal, again, than we understand now. We will understand that. But what Wittgenstein would say is whether or not a dog or a lion speaks words like us, it's not important to them. They perceive their world as they do, and they think about it as they do, if they think like us at all. So they need not think, nor need the world, such that the world need not conceptualize or verbalize or mathematize itself the way that human hands and minds and tongues and mouths and lungs do. So Vatsyayana is mentioning a very important Wittgensteinian point to me. Yes, I would agree with you if I walk into a table, says, ouch, you walk into the bar, you got to take the LSAT, is that essentially you can walk into a table and perceive a table as a table, but unless you say, ouch, this stupid thing shouldn't be here, you aren't conceptualizing it much. And why would you be? Because it would only be when the table, a la Heidegger, and Wittgenstein knows his Heidegger, says Heidegger's running up against the limits of language. Because if I bump into a table, it's only when I say this stupid table should or shouldn't be here that I am with desire or fear, wanting or not wanting something, that I would be conceptualizing the table. So here, conceptualization, we should probably somewhat do away with that language and say, how much are we verbalizing? Because in a certain sense, when I see a table as a table with my eyes, I'm conceptualizing, but that's a different level of conceptualizing. Arrangement, let's say, as when I verbalize it. And logicians here, I have to say, at least 1,000 years ago, these Nyaya logicians were on point with what I very much love in latter Wittgenstein. Technically, when your eyes and your ears hear things, you are conditioned to hear them a certain way, but that's different from verbalization and logic, which also slides right in, and verbal practices get intertangled with everything else. Children have emotions, they have perception, and they remember things. Wittgenstein says, what is the sound of a clarinet? What does a clarinet sound like? You don't speak paragraphs to yourself, you imagine it. Most likely. In fact, an expert on music theory probably would not spend 17 pages describing what a clarinet sounds like. They would be like, go listen to one. Because verbalization and logic is not the primary level of reality. And not for us, not for dogs, not for anything, but not even for human beings. Whether or not dogs have much verbiage or baggage in the Attic and the Athenian. So it's remarkably close to Wittgenstein. Vatsyayana argues that we can see what we think is smoke and infer there is fire, or hear that there is a fire by testimony, or make comparisons for ourselves from afar. Notice the use of all of these. But it is perception, seeing the fire, that is best, and that best confirms comparisons, testimony, and inferences. Giving a negative example, he similarly argues that seeing a mirage and hoping for water, it is only when we see what isn't there, the water's absence, that our inferences disproved. Which again, I can't think of anybody who explains this stuff better than any of that. We can also make solid inferences, such as hearing thunder and inferring there was lightning without making comparisons or hearing the testimony of others. Without which, this is spelling out probably the Nyaya were thinking this back in the day, but this is the commentator on the commentator on the commentators. That's, yes, terrible joke about potatoes, which I will not tell you here about the commentators. That's essentially, this is all as concretely talked out as you'll find anybody doing it simply to you today. With knowledge, perception is best. This is a quote from the text. With knowledge, perception is best. When we learn something from trustworthy testimony, we may still want to know it another way, such as by inference. Understanding by inference, we may still want to know it through experience. But seeing it, the desire to know ceases, as in the example of fire above. By the way, let's just talk about anti-vaxxing for just a moment, actually, here. I know that's controversial. Think about, and I'm not, I was vaccinated. You know, I have no reason to think my parents were. I have no reason, even though we're all mentally weird, I have no reason to not vaccinate my future children, nor do I realize I wouldn't. Although I would tell you I don't verbalize that much. I trust experts. I don't logic about immunology much at all. And this would be the admission of that because, of course, that's not my area, and in fact, I would be amazed if it was a conspiracy. And that would be distrust, and sources of trust and distrust, much more than empirical evidence. Which is why I'm saying, why do you think it is that many people would say, well, theoretically you may be right in the talk about vaccines, but when I see stuff going on in my neighborhood and things happening to children, and then I see needles get poked into children, primarily I would draw inferences in one way rather than another. I would just offer that rather than actually tell yourself that some people in life are illogical or and others are logical. I personally would advise you to stop using the word logical to simply mean, like the Nyaya, right thinking. I would advise you to understand logical to mean any human thinking, and there's better and worse, but we can use logic in ways. For me, saying the anti-vaxxers are non-adverbial would not be a thing. And similarly, you have sources you trust or distrust, and you weave it together as human logic and talk and conception. You would find anti-vaxxers probably doing logicking a lot more about vaccines than folks like me. That has nothing to do with whether their views are right, understand, are justifiable according to the Nyaya. In fact, hopefully the Nyaya would crack right in here and be like, well, those are not being drawn all that great, but how much do you sit around asking how much vaxxers or anti-vaxxers draw their inferences right? I imagine, like Wittgenstein says of the tribe that dream they go to the moon, you just write them off or tell them to go live somewhere else or pay more attention to this or that. You would not reason with debate. You would not verbalize with them further, which shows you exactly how logical and illogical humanity is, even at our best and most proud and in our most correct of practices. I do believe in mentioning that, so please don't take that as doubt about vaccines, which I don't mean to sow. What it is, however, is you can find people trusting or distrusting parts of science or not, and that would have to do very much with their perception of their world and how much they see science in their lives helping children or not, or how much corporations are in their lives helping children with science or not. Probably the direct experience of having needles with children is far more visceral and thus draws the inferences for those folks much more. And technically they aren't going entirely out of bounds here. They just hopefully in the Nyaya would point out, well, there's a this or to the that, or there's more of this, and talking to more experts. And the Nyaya are telling you to trust expert testimony because they are in courts of law with Hindu kings, etc., princes, what have yous, with the upper castes. So, which Gautama almost certainly was upper caste Brahmin. So, Vatsyayana explains comparison with the example that a yak is like a cow, and that this sameness is understood in terms of universals, generals, classes of things with shared properties, such as having horns or having four legs. Comparisons can be valid or invalid, depending on whether or not they are supported by inference, testimony, and of course, perception. Testimony, like perception and the rest, can be valid or not, as we all know from personal experience. Sometimes witnesses lie, and other times they are mistaken, either seeing what they couldn't have or not seeing what they could have. Notice we would use logic and reasoning and debate to figure out if the eyes and ears could have seen that or heard the shot or not. Heard the catapult, which early Indians had, earlier than most. There is a psychology experiment that is somewhat well known where there's a video about racism, etc., that there are subjects in line in a bank. You may have seen this video. You can find it probably on YouTube, where there are It was done, I believe, in the 70s, 80s, what have you, in which there are a line of people in a bank line. One of them is a black dude. And there's a shot that goes off and everybody scatters. And some say they see a gun and they see the black dude had a gun. Technically, nobody has a gun and your mind is hallucinating and seeing something there. Like when you step on an escalator, it's not moving and it feels like it's moving backwards or something like that. I've had confused looks by students before. Whenever your perception does not work the way it does and you feel like it's almost going backwards or something like that. Again, those sorts of ways our minds fill things in is much what the Nyaya are pointing out. So you could have somebody on the stand, they say, no, I heard the shot of the catapult. You say, but did you really? And before that, and then you catch them in a contradiction. And the Nyaya do not like contradictions. Buddhists and relativists do like contradictions. They think they're very human. These guys are looking for contradictions, and we do in people a lot for very specific purposes. When you're doing philosophy, you can contradict yourself plenty. When you're in the witness stand and you're saying when you heard the bullet, you probably should not contradict yourself much there, regardless of how human and impermanent and temporary, meaning or people are or not, according to the Hindus or Buddhists. It's all debatable, still. So we can construct false memories out of our false perceptions. Vatsyayana, the later commentator, says inference is the source that comes last. Reasoning comes last, after experience involving perception, analogy, comparison, and testimony, which is very true, or at least comes along with, so meta. The Sutra says inference depends on previous perception and is of three types: from something prior, something latter, and from something in common. Vatsyayana gives an example of each. If we see swollen storm clouds pregnant with rain and infer it will rain, we infer from something prior, inferring an effect from a cause prior to it. If we see an overflowing river and infer it rained before upstream, we infer from something latter, that we are perceiving something that is affected by something caused which we do not perceive. If we infer that the sun was in one place and now another in the sky, we can infer that it moved as a difference between the two. I learned my Wittgenstein from Sluga, Stroud, and others at Berkeley. Sluga's work, which I do follow and like, does talk about how there's various ways of speciation in time and space that do show things very much like this. What you find in the Nyaya is that there's various arrangements and forms of life by which we would use things one way and the opposite way, the very same sorts of things that we call the moves of logic and argument and perception, etc. The Sutra says that certainty is grasping something by thinking about possibilities, investigating thesis and counter-thesis, and that the sources can be objects of knowledge themselves, like a measuring scale, which you would have in marketplaces around the world, and Anubis and others are watching with the ancient Egyptians for your soul. Vatsyayana figuring out if it's going to be permanent or not, like the Jains versus the Buddhists versus the Hindus in debate. Vatsyayana adds that a scale can calibrate a second scale if we weigh gold with the first and then with the second, such that we know the second scale is off or not. Thus we can use a tried and true knowledge source or a wise person, like watching with our eyes, to test another knowledge source, or person, like a theory we find in a text or the testimony of witnesses. It's remarkable. Unfortunately, it does suffer from all the same human problems the Nyaya are pointing out most fiercely here. The Sutra says critics, such as the Jains and the Buddhists, could say this leads to an infinite regress. They don't say Jains and Buddhists by name, probably wouldn't yet, but they mean people like this. They would say this leads to problems and infinite regresses, such that no source can be entirely established. Consider the first scale could be off and all of them are off. The answer for the Nyaya is the evidence is like the light of a lamp, again, self-evident in itself. You can see, now notice this does leans a bit towards intelligent design. The world is truthful, not deceptive in itself, such that the world is more like the light of the lamp than the absence of the light. That would very much be an argument to give more pragmatically against something more nihilistically skeptical, perhaps. Which is how the Nyaya possibly perceive the Buddhists, although they are not such skeptics themselves. Although they are drawing out a lot of marvelous forms of skepticism here, early on, drawing out the problems with objective knowledge. The Nyaya Sutra says sometimes no further source is required, which is true in practice. A lot of times we see something, that's it, and we don't require further proof. Sometimes there is times when we need further proof, and there is no fixed rule for determining this. Wittgenstein would say the same. You would have to look at the current practices. There is no evaluation of evidence independent of practices for Wittgenstein's latter thought. There would only be in a situation what counts in this situation, and it would only be as permanent as the tables, chairs, and practices and words. Because we, like the Hindu Nyaya, seek freedom, discipline, pleasure, and wealth in this proper descending order of the Hindu values, which I gave in an earlier lecture, we proceed from what is to what we desire, which isn't, which is explicitly said in the text. So proceed from what you solidly are to what you aren't yet, but perceive as not being, the darkness which you can then fill with light, the ignorance with knowledge and wisdom. The sutra says that opponents argue that objects are like dreams, mirages, or magic cities in the sky, not fixed as real, and says that they haven't provided a reason to accept this. Vatsyayana says when we wake, we see with perception that the dreams weren't real, which shows us perception and illusion are different. A Buddhist could object, maybe all life is but a dream, as you find in the opening of Alice in Wonderland in the poem. The Nyaya would say perception is primary and more certain than comparison, and we can constantly see this, which is how we live, and then they will lean more towards the positive. This is a very long lecture, I understand. We are already going on an hour 20. So we have only a couple of other examples here, and we have some fallacies, so let us get to finishing all of this out. I have been taking my sweet time in making the comparisons, but obviously that is decently valid. And again, people do not know this material in the world of philosophy very much at all, which is why it's sad for me, because I love Wittgenstein, and this is some very Wittgensteinian stuff. And whether or not you lean more positivist or pragmatic in America, you would definitely be very Wittgensteinian decently, as everybody sort of says. Well, plenty of people anyway. The Nyaya Sutra says that words are used to refer in three ways, to individuals, forms, and classes, and these multiple ways produce doubt, which sparks inquiry. This is also very Wittgensteinian. Vatsyayana provides us with the example of cow, and says the word refers to an individual cow, which it does, cow. This is a cow. So it's like cow, points to this. It says the word refers to anything shaped like a cow, which is the metaphor, and that is like a cow, but not. A lot of people think a metaphor is fakely like something. No. It is, life is like a sailing ship in that it's only a certain length that travels. Those are true in a sense. And then they're also not true in that life doesn't have a sail, etc. So anything that's cow-like, which means a statue of a cow is a cow, because it is very cow-like. But it is a cow-like and a cow in a different way than something that is a specific cow. This is very true, and I think Wittgenstein would nod in appreciation. And that is how best to handle metaphors, I would say. And the Indian folks are well aware of metaphors, and that one refers to the gods, abstract beings, as are Greek philosophers, anthropomorphically, and is that real or not? And there's debated opinions about how much truth is anthropomorphic or not. As I would say with Wittgenstein, is the world truthful to you? Like a nice person? Nice lady? Well, depends if God speaks in ancient Hebrew or in several other questions. According to Jewish mysticism, God used the Hebrew words light and dark to separate light from darkness. If you do believe that, then the world is quite verbalized, at least mystically so, although that could be itself a metaphor, and only somewhat like, because I'm Californian, so like this. And says the word, but of course there's a third word, which is cows. So cow means all the cows. Cows means the group of all cows. So all of them, all together, is cow. That's three uses of the word, and you'll notice they're all very much as we use English, French, anything. Modern, Sanskrit, what have yous. Yes, Urdu, Purview, etc. So the Nyaya argue all have horns and four legs, and forms of cows do, and thus there is the general group. Vatsyayana says the object of the word is thus determined by our ability to use it in these ways. The sutra refers to those who refutes those who think words refer to only one of these things, and they argue this is where these confusions come from. I would argue the latter work of Wittgenstein is extremely like this, and you can find it. He is pointing out this theorist And then this theorist says this, but really not all examples apply, and we have to let the fly out of the fly bottle with all that. The Sutra uses the example of a clay cow, which has the form of a cow and is included in things that have 4 feet, like a cow, because it has 4 clay feet, like Clayfoot, of the Buddhist long dialogue. But as Vatsyayana adds, if somebody says to wash, bring, or donate a cow, and we hand them a cow statue, we are wrong and do not satisfy their request, as it lacks the category of being alive or an animal, so it's wrong sort of cow, even if it's a cow statue. I said with Wishi, if I'm like, I'll come to the party later, and I cut off and send my finger, this is me, right? But if I send this and not all of me, I am misusing the term me as far as you understand it, because me can mean part of me, and it can mean all of me. Why not take all of me to the party, you know? Well, uses of language like that. And does the mind ever resolve it with a system, or need not? Here's looking at you, kid, you know. Debate manuals like the Nyaya Sutra of Gautama, the Organon of Aristotle, and works by Mois in China and others were designed to introduce students and scholars to forms of argument, methods of attack and defense. Like Aristotle, Vatsyayana argues that debate proceeds from motives, and so a destructive skeptic debates destructively, without a committed motive or accepted doctrine. Just all's like relative and stuff. Some have claimed that Aristotle's syllogisms are deductively valid, but Gautama's syllogistic forms of proof are not, and based on induction. Actually, again, I've seen that in print. Technically, Aristotle and everyone would base their syllogisms on induction. Aristotle would not say, no, I'm basing this on the metaphysical form of the cow and not observing material cows, whether or not the form's material of fire and light, which is a little weird question there in Greek philosophy. Are forms material or not at all? Weird, tough questions. But Aristotle, especially for Aristotle, who's more the materialist, one would say, but that would depend on that question. So technically, Aristotle would also say he went around and looked at cows. So actually, it's not that one's deductive and one's inductive. That is quite mistaken, because what of your thinking is deductive as paired to, and separate from all of your induction? That question would not make much sense to either Aristotle or Gautama or modern psychology, I would argue. Try to think without thinking either way, involving either. You can use examples of one, very much one, but try and make say something, a complete thought, if there is such a thing entirely, without using both deduction and induction. And Aristotle, most of his syllogisms are not the four forms of the one form with four parts and one form of the perfect one, and all those other ones, he says, depend on other examples in the Organon, in those texts. So, in prior and posterior analytics, no jokes here about posterior analytics, again. So yeah, these were studied by Islamic and Catholic logicians and then later Protestants, whom the Muslims and Catholics do not trust. Neither do I. So we can see induction and deduction working together in the syllogistic forms of these. So to make proofs easier, I actually rearrange Aristotle's stuff. Technically Aristotle says if B then C, if A then B, therefore A then C. I purposely tell my students I am rearranging these because it's easier to say if A then C, if B then C, therefore if A then C, obviously, but that's not what Aristotle technically says. He puts it in the weirder way. And of course it works either way. Similarly, there are ways where the Nyaya proofs, there are 5 lines, and if you repeat the last 3, 3, 4, 5, it is very syllogistic, and they repeat the thing where they repeat the conclusion and then the running up reason and then have it almost mirrored in form. So I eliminate that and rearrange that. Again, my apologies, but that makes it much easier to teach both Aristotle and they line up so fierce when you rearrange them ever so slightly with the same meaning. I would argue, happy to hear otherwise, you can see it. So let's get here to Gautama's. Aristotle says, if Socrates is a man and if all men are mortal, then all men are mortal. Then Socrates is mortal. Great. Yes. So that would be a rearranging of Aristotle the way that I'm talking about. Many often say it that way, except that Aristotle technically says all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so he does BCAC. So again, either order, here's Gautama, as best as I can give it to you. Wherever there is smoke, there is fire, as in a kitchen. Includes a concrete example. So because there is smoke on the hill, there is fire on the hill. That is again quite identical to Socrates as a man is mortal. If you just arrange it a tiny bit different and don't add in any other text or any other words, it's very much the same of Aristotle, and this is probably earlier historically, by the way. But not only can one not prove well, you can't prove borrowing, but also people get real fierce in defending Aristotle and saying he's the first logical man on earth. It's kind of crazy, but it's historical and it's bound up with empire and culture and all of that stuff. And 1,000+ years of the Abrahamic tradition with Christians slowly wrestling Aristotle in power from Muslims. So, yeah, the Muslims, by the way, are between the Chinese, Indians, and the Europeans. So usually, like the grandfather effect, they say the Muslims soaked up stuff from everybody and traded stuff back and forth with everybody, and they're kind of hated and share a border with everybody else. They've had war with everybody else. I'm from the Haight-Ashbury, so Indians and Chinese thought it's kind of cool. Well, that's because Europe doesn't share a border with India or China, so there isn't direct war a whole lot of time, and people are worried about China getting into space and all that, etc., around these here parts. So, well, we've come a little bit closer since then, It's a small world. Small world. Yes. Claim your set of general reasoning. So you have here also, that's the positive proof. That's an example of the positive proof. The second example is a negative proof. Again, because they perceive what is not there. And this one has to do with sound being and it has to do with the permanence of the self. So you have here, sound is made. Whatever is made is impermanent. Sound of two hands or one hand clapping if one hand, a la Bart Simpson, can. Like a pot. A pot is made by humans. Sound is made by humans. Words and verbal reasoning is made by humans. So, sound, which includes words, is impermanent. There's another version of this in the text which actually says, unlike the self. So, the Hindus would have used this to argue yourself is sort of begotten, not made, like Jesus in the Creed, Apostles' Creed. Being a bad half-lapsed Catholic, of course, I was sort of half hippie Buddhist, half Catholic as a child, liberal Catholic as a child, with my father and mother. So with all of that, self is permanent for the Hindus, and they would say because you are not like a pot, because you were not made, your soul was not made by human beings, which seems implied by this, unlike that which is made with human hands. Yes, a la two of them for the Buddhists. All of this, again, it is such a shame that people read Zen and think, ooh, it's mystical. When it is, of course, because stuff's mystical and Zen are into all sorts of folks and things. But it's clearly based on history in which people are arguing with concrete examples and simple psychology, physics, etc. that's still quite believable. Maybe the Greeks were the first to be serious about nature and logic along with Aristotle, which you will read in print a surprising amount of times if you look it up. Teaching history of logic, again, it's just maddening, like the ignorance of this stuff. So the Nyaya Sutra also lists fallacies, like you find with Aristotle in Sophistical Refutations, and you find very much celebrated in the work of Lewis Carroll. It's almost like Alice in Wonderland is a recipe of fallacies, as well as I argue Aristotelian forms, like the 10 categories backwards, such that the Cheshire Cat is space and the caterpillar is time, and teaches Alice patience, like the Nyaya and others and the Stoics argue, believing in objective truth, but you need to learn patience, and thus the moves of all of this, slowly. As in all things, whether you are optimistic and objective or somewhat pessimistic and subjective about human truth, do it slowly, do it carefully, and learn the ropes and the snakes, kids. Like, that's what it's for. That's what these things are for. The Nyaya Sutra lists these fallacies. And it says we can see a post in the dark and mistake it for a man. I use this example all the time. Your eyes can lie to you insofar as they speak words and they don't, and then your mind would talk words at you internally and lie to you about it. You would perceive with your eyes, not exactly a lie verbally, that something is a tree when it's a man, or that, oh no, there's a man over there, it turns out that it's a tree stump. People had this problem in the ancient and modern worlds, of course. So eyes can lie. Again, believe half of what you see, and some or none of what I'm telling you right now. Go out and look at pots and trees and figure this out for yourself. The sutra warns us, much like Aristotle, that debate is about winning. Both Aristotle and Gautama say something very interesting I often bring up. Human thought, I have a lot of narcissistic energy. I'm like, I know the book, How to Eat Like a Child, which I loved as a kid. I'm so interesting and I know such interesting things. Want to hear one. I have a lot of energy. Technically, debate is about winning, as are elections. Now, but you want to be right. You want to be truthful. You don't want to just win, unlike elections. You know what I mean? So, essentially, what you got to do is, and Aristotle says the same thing, you want to win Technically, you don't want to win cheaply and stupidly because later somebody calls you out, you look like a chump, which is always still true this whole time over. Just because you win, if somebody calls you out, that could make you look like a fool plenty. Could. So, given that, you can make clinchers, the translators translate this as, cheap shots, or you can quibble, as it is translated, nitpick, but you could lose the debate if you take cheap moves. Obviously, if you take... There's many issues, of course, with sports and everything. You can, and people do cheat, and in fact, possibly, in a lot of this doping stuff and other things, everybody is. Technically, if you get caught, you lose regardless of what the public knows about cheating, etc. Some people want to put an asterisk by Bond's name, etc. in baseball. Other people have pointed out, technically, you should put an asterisk next to everybody's name, and then, of course, nobody would. So why the asterisk next to one? And, of course, with all of that, it's like, technically, when you get caught, you lose. You know what I mean? And I'm not going to say anything more because I've never been professionally in sports. So yeah, don't got the right to talk, but you can watch a horrifying documentary or two about all of that. So technically you want to win, but you also want to be right, and it's a balancing act. And neither Aristotle nor the Nyaya actually solve this problem. Instead, they are pointing out the problems with all of this. For fallacies, the Sutra includes, these are awesome. I love them. They're very Lewis Carroll also. Silence, which would lose a debate. You just sit there. Say nothing. If you don't talk, I have a lot of energy and argument. I can get you to shut up. Well, you don't look so hot. Changing the thesis, obviously you point out, but you're arguing something different than where you were before. I would advise you, notice how much people cover their bases in arguments, such that the first thing they say and the last thing they say are almost always covering their bases opposed to each other. If you notice that, you can catch almost anybody, including me, in contradicting themselves. But what does that mean? That anybody's right or wrong? Try it out. Contradicting the thesis, changing or contradicting it, which is more directly changing it against itself. Evasion, actually in the commentaries, it says in translation, I am called by nature. I need to go behind this tree over here for a while. I can't debate you about whether or not the self is permanent because I'm in an impermanent and partial position at the moment, subjectively. Technically, again, that loses, as I always like to say, in The Simpsons, it's like, I'll be right back in the courtroom and you hear stomp, 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 slam, airplane. I don't think he's coming back. I am called by nature to go take a plane somewhere. Another of the fallacies is meaningless or incoherent speech. He is speaking the language of gods. No, technically he doesn't know what to say right here. Let's not talk about politics. Chomsky gave the example, colorless sleep furiously green, which he thinks is meaningless. Fortunately, Wittgenstein could say that could mean a lot, especially as a silly example, and that we grasp it does not mean something, but it is a couple of sounds and words, so now it has meaning. Damn it. Foiled again, because it was by these lousy teenagers, So, overlooking the fallacies in another's argument, if you miss an opponent's mistakes, that could be a mistake. Repetition, simply repeating, this is great. This is great. I argue this is great. Well, that's repetition. That's not good enough. Which you can always point out about somebody. Again, all of these things, will that win? Well, it's debate. My personal favorite, sharing the fault. Sharing the fault is a fantastic concept. Pointing out a fault that is in an opponent that is also a fault in your own argument. Such as, my opponent is putting forward a mere mortal point of view. People do this to each other a lot, and I point this out a lot. I like skepticism and relativism and subjectivity. So a lot of times people will say, well, that isn't absolutely proved and scientific. Technically, again, and I say, so could gravity become Zerblat next, 1,000 years? Oh yeah, sure, if that's true. And it's like, well, then, as with the fallibility of all of this, a la Popper, etc., it's that technically we are not undoing pragmatism here entirely, a la positivism. We're not outproving it, such that there are imperfect human practices. And technically, and you watch yourself in these, and a lot of times if people anger you in debate and pointing out something hypocritically about you, that would be this sort of thing. Sharing the fault, but especially is pointing out something about that's just a point of view. That's like your opinion, man. Well, yeah. I have an opinion and belief that gravity's real. I have an opinion and belief that vaccines work perfectly fine and aren't a conspiracy. That is like my knowledgeable opinion, man, given the impermanence and fallibility of human knowledge and science. Yeah. No, but that would be sharing the fault. There's people online, there's atheists who say, you don't know God, therefore nature and science. And there's others who say, you don't know nature and science, therefore God. And they go round and round and round and round and round because nobody can fully prove God or nature is just science. How is nature science? Science is human practices. Nature is like shaking test tubes. It's that we do a lot of stuff, it repeats itself. We then say, well, it must be whatever invisible thing we call lying behind it plenty. And then people get into arguments, well, you haven't proved your giant objectivity entirely. That's all invisible and speculative, as opposed to your concrete examples of apples constantly falling on the head of Isaac Newton or not. He really needs to stop sleeping under that tree. But yeah, effectively, that's as good as it gets with all of this. So that's sharing the fault. Sharing the fault is saying something that's true of everybody, which, again, if we're relativistic, you may have to share the fault a bit and be like, but we don't really know, and then hopefully go on from there and supply something else, because that's just that alone is a problem. Many terrible arguments end with sharing the fault, I have to say, especially mine. So the Sutra gives 3 types of quibbling. Fakely bringing up red herrings, bringing up problems that don't turn out to be problems. So one of them is bringing up problems. The other one is not bringing up problems that are not problems. Again, notice the positive and the lack of the negative. Again, as a constant organizing theme here, very Hegelian, quite. Hegel has his own logics. They're harder to read, honestly, than the poor translations we have of these texts, I have to say. Maybe it's ancient versus modern times, or maybe it's German. I don't know. Both the Indians and the Germans love cramming 20 words together to make particular terms. The Chinese and others are like, yeah, something simpler than that makes a lot of sense. We'll get to that with Zen. But yes, the 3 types of quibbling, which correspond to the 3 uses of words: things, form, and class. So Vatsyayana is telling us, oh, there's ways we use words, and part of the proof that he's not making this up wholly himself is that the Nyaya are pointing out 3 types of quibbling, which correspond to what Vatsyayana later explains, hundreds of years later, are the 3 uses of words, very Wittgensteinian. Vatsyayana gives us examples of each, as he does with his commentary for everything in the sutra. For quibbling over words used for things, he says someone could say that they have a new, nava, blanket, and somebody else could misunderstand, notice there aren't plurals here like with Chinese, and think that they claim they had 9 blankets. Because if I say nava blanket, I say 9 blanket. Those words could mean 9 blankets, or it could mean that I have new blanket, or I have new blankets, or I could mean 9 blankets. Technically, it could also mean 9 blanket, as in blanket number 9, which I don't believe is a terrible band name yet. So, and if somebody mistakes this, aha, they said that. This happens a lot. Somebody mishears somebody else, or they just decide to say, well, I like subjectivity. So you don't believe in truth at all in the slightest. Yeah, that ain't that, is it? Subjective truth is human truth, so that's some truth to the slightest, yes, specifically. There's a lot of ways people misuse arguments like this, saying, well, then you don't believe in anything good or decent at all. It's a very common human argument. You hear that from both political sides. Yeah, that wouldn't be it. Whenever you hear, I'm very lefty, you hear people being like, well, those people would just want to kill children or something. Yeah, this is marked for children again. No, they don't, children. Nobody really entirely wants to simply kill all the children. But that's what everybody gets accused of because they're just speaking rhetorically, trying to win rather than be so right in Nyaya about any of this. So, for quibbling over form, someone could say the stands cry out. I misunderstood this a while ago as the scaffolds cry out, and it's the scaffolds, and I actually thought it was like hanging people or executing people if it wasn't hanging. Technically what it means is they built stands and there's a royal procession passing by, and they cry out, oh, here's the king, yay. So the stands cry out are probably celebrating royalty, actually, rather than booing who's ever getting, or cheering on an execution or whatever have you. But if somebody says, well, stands can't cry out, they're made of metal and wood, you jerk. You're like, I was using a metaphor, thanks, and improperly understanding people, well, it can get you to win or it can get you to be right either way, with this. So for quibbling over class, someone could say all Brahmins are educated. This happens a lot in language too, because of the general ways we use language. You say all Brahmins are educated, possibly to construct an example of a Nyaya syllogism, and someone says not all Brahmins are educated because some are only 3 years old and just learning to talk. Well, obviously your word did not mean them. I will, this is also a lecture for the logic class. I'm going to include it with that. So let me point out this. If I say horses,
I would often mean a four-legged horse. And if you brought me a three-legged horse, I'd be like, that's not good enough for me. Now, did you do what I asked you or not if you bring me a three-legged horse? Let's say you bring me a horse that's almost dead, and I say I want a horse to plow a field. You didn't do it right, but you brought me a horse, right? But you misunderstood me, right? There's similar things here where you can say, well, science, religion, by that I mean good. A lot of people are like, religion, by that I mean bad. Or by science, I mean that as good. And you're like, so Chernobyl or something like that, or the worst of things like the Tuskegee study, which is a little bit all wrapped up with the anti-vaxxing, of course, regardless of who all that happened to or not, is that it's like, well, science is good. It's like, well, what about the bad science? Is that scientific? What about like freezing Korean prisoners of war to death and then us collecting the data on all that? Is that scientific? Oh, well, that's scientific too. Then we generally talk about science as aimed at the public good, and we don't mean that's essential to science. Whenever it's not aimed at the public good, it's not science then. That's like, again, saying that when I call for a horse and I mean a four-legged thing that can plow decently, you bring me a three-legged horse that is dying. I say you didn't bring me a horse. That is incorrect. You misunderstood my various uses of words like horse and apple, so you could certainly misunderstand my words about politics or the Democratic and Republican parties if I refer to any as good or not. You will find this in politics so fierce. What happens is somebody brings up something good or bad. Somebody says that isn't perfect words. Well, never was heard entirely a discourage and triggering word. In politics, none. Whether or not they're amendable fences. So, with all of that, you will find all these continuous problems of human language. I highly recommend the world, American universities learn more about Indian logic, as well as the whole British Anglophonic Empire post, etc. Maybe it's in the mail. But other than that, it is, thank you for letting me share all of this with you. This will serve as a lecture not only for Indian thought, Buddhist thought, but also for logic. I do love this subject, Something Fierce. I think it fits powerfully with Wittgenstein, his philosophical investigations and uncertainty. I think it fits well with Everett's Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, as far as when did human beings acquire practices of math, and is math in the head originally, or is it in the head interacting with the world? Such that math is or isn't permanent in our lives, no matter how structural it may be, along an endless line, in a square, in a triangle with three values, however we wish to practice or construct it. Little binary switches, what have you. Technically, again, in binary, there's only two numbers the whole entire time, and 2 ain't one of them. So much love, much happiness, much enlightenment, and all of that, and I will see you when I see you with my eyes, even though you might be a tree stump in the dark.